Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation features writer Emma Straub. Emma is the author of the novels The Vacationers and Laura Lamont's Life and Pictures, and the short story collection Other People We Married. Her fiction and nonfiction have been published in Vogue, New York Magazine, Tin House, The New York Times, Good Housekeeping, and the Paris Review Daily. Her most recent novel, The Vacationers, came out last week on Riverhead Books, and it's been receiving absolutely fantastic reviews, including 2 in the New York Times, which in one review called it one of the summer's most entertaining novels, and in another called it gorgeously written. Meanwhile, People magazine gave it a rave review, too long to read in the confines of this format, so I'll just give you one crucial word from that review: delicious. My conversation with Emma is a little bit of a departure for The Third Story, in part because she's the first non-musician I've talked to, and in part because we've known each other for quite a while. Our parents are old friends who met at college in Wisconsin in the 1960s, so there's a very easy rapport between us that was extremely enjoyable for me, and I think it's pretty clear from the first moments of the conversation. I was excited to talk to Emma in this context to get a sense of her creative process and to hear how her personal experiences inform that process. Emma grew up in New York City in a family that valued the written word enormously. Her father, Peter Straub, is a best-selling author of nearly 20 novels, as well as numerous novellas and short story collections, and her mother, Susan Straub, worked for many years to develop a program designed to encourage reading to children called the Read to Me program. So it's not a huge surprise that Emma was drawn early on to a career in writing. In the conversation, Emma talks about how in her early 20s, after graduating from college, she wrote several novels that were rejected, and how that rejection really influenced her approach and changed her approach. It was confronting that rejection that ultimately made her a better writer. The whole story around that is very informative. She also talks about how her experience of selling books in a Brooklyn bookstore influenced her writing and her understanding of the book business. And finally, notable for me is her ongoing relationship with Stephen Merritt of the Magnetic Fields, the band The Magnetic Fields. The relationship started, I guess you could say professionally. She was his personal assistant, but quickly morphed into something more nuanced and rich and subtle and beautiful. Emma, along with her husband and regular creative partner, Mike Fusco, started designing and selling merchandise for the Magnetic Fields, touring with the band, and starting to assume more and more roles that bridge the gap between professional and personal. The relationship with Stephen is very interesting, and to hear her talk about it, I found extremely enlightening. Emma is, in her own right, a truly modern writer in that she completely embraces new media and makes herself very available to her admirers as well as to the people that she admires. Overall, she's become a kind of model for how to develop a real community of supporters and friends using Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and maybe some other things that I haven't even heard of yet. But she does it in a natural and elegant way, and it doesn't feel forced. It feels very easy. In fact, I think that's kind of the magic of Emma, is that she manages to make it all look so easy. Behind a nice, normal, passionate, charming woman is an enormous amount of talent and a tremendous work ethic. But it just feels easy and natural, and that's just because of who she is. It's hard to teach it or learn it. There are so many wonderful takeaways from our conversation, and so much overlap between her reality as a writer and many of the realities that all creative people face. I think the biggest thing I was left with was the idea of finding your voice. She repeatedly says that it's not something that can be created or invented. It's something that's already there, that you can find and cultivate. In the cut between embracing who you are and working diligently to hone it, that's where your creative voice emerges. Maybe I'm putting words into her mouth, but that's what I'm taking with me from our talk. I just love this conversation, and I'm delighted to know Emma Straub. I couldn't decide if I should play any audio example of Emma reading or talking before the interview, and I decided ultimately that I'll let her speak for herself. So for this, my 10th installment of The Third Story, we're going to do things a little differently and just go straight into it. However, there's a special treat waiting for you if you make it to the end of the episode, the song I wrote with my wife Amanda for Emma and her husband Mike on the occasion of their wedding in 2008, affectionately called The Ballad of Emma and Mike. Without further ado, here we go. My conversation with Emma Straub.
Emma Straub.
Oh, it's already happening.
It's happening.
Oh, my God. Whew, whew, whew.
It is so great to have you here.
Thanks, Leo.
I don't want to make too big a deal out of it, but you sort of made reference to it when I asked you about doing this. You would be officially my first non-musician podcast victim.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to talk to you because I think there's so much... First of all, I think you are a musician in a lot of ways. I think you have a musician's heart.
I definitely don't have any of a musician's skills, though, so I'm glad you didn't say that. Like, I completely tone deaf. My ears are broken. But thank you. A heart, sure, I'll take a heart.
You'll go with a heart.
Okay.
But I think that there's a lot of common ground. And also, you know, I like you, and I would like to hang out with you. And basically, this is an excuse to hang out.
Sure. I'll take it.
I guess I would just like to start at the start.
Okay. Which start?
You grew up in New York?
I did. I sort of thought that we might start at this spot because, of course, Leo, you are from Wisconsin. And when my first novel came out, Laura Lamont&rsquo Life in Pictures, there's a lot of Wisconsin stuff in it. And I got a whole lot of like Wisconsin love and like all
credibility.
The Wisconsin newspapers were really nice to me and people kept asking me about Wisconsin. And many, many, many times people incorrectly said, "Oh, Emma Straub, she's from Wisconsin."
Right.
And I sort of just absorbed it all, and I felt like an adopted daughter of Wisconsin.
Honorary Wisconsinite.
Honorary Wisconsinite. I felt a little like a slightly fraudulent.
Yeah.
Because I'm not from Wisconsin. I mean, my parents are from Wisconsin and my whole family's from Wisconsin, but I grew up in New York City. And when I was a child, really until I was in graduate school, the idea of Wisconsin was such a snooze to me. We went when I was a kid and I was like, ugh, God. And the problem was really that we were in like hotels in like downtown Milwaukee on like the day after Christmas or something when like the whole place was deserted.
Frozen and deserted. So that was my vision of Wisconsin, which is not. Well, I think Wisconsin can be frozen and deserted.
Sure, but in many, many months of the year, Wisconsin is a lovely, beautiful, green, friendly, wonderful place, which I did not know.
This is like a sort of a confession. Like you because you know I'm from Wisconsin, you want to come clean about your feelings.
Oh, yeah.
But what's interesting, number one, as you mentioned, both of your parents are from Wisconsin. I should be asking you this question, but I know too much. I can't pretend I don't. But the other thing is you, although you're a New Yorker, you have an East Coast sensibility, but your personality kind of feels Midwestern.
Yeah.
You know?
People have always said that to me that when I was in elementary school, actually, my friends would often say that about my parents too, that like they weren't New Yorkers and that they felt really different than everyone else's parents. When I was a kid, even when I was in high school, my friends would sometimes mimic my mother as if she had a Wisconsin accent, which she really doesn't. Do you think she does? I don't think she does.
I don't know. I think it's the same thing with, New Yorkers who think they don't have New York accents tend to have really thick New York accents. And I think Wisconsinites probably who think they don't have Wisconsin accents also probably
Well, I have a lot of cousins who really
have the real thing.
Really sound like they're from Wisconsin, but yeah, I never heard that in my parents' voices, but maybe it's there. But yeah, I think it went beyond that it wasn't just that they sounded like Midwestern and nice, but they really are. And I think I did absorb or inherit that like I am, I think, friendlier than people assume native New Yorkers are. I don't know. Is that true? Maybe that's true.
I think people assume that native New Yorkers are not friendly. That's definitely true.
Right.
And I think you are friendlier than that assumption. Yes. No, that's true. But I also think what's interesting about that is that, people who come to New York or the United States from another country, whose parents have thick accents from another language, grow up in New York and end up sounding like they're from New York.
Right.
And your parents just came from Wisconsin and somehow you kept that. Like you didn't take on that New Yorker's identity.
Yeah. Although I did, so the review, my new book comes out as of this recording on Thursday in a few days. And I've been getting really, really nice reviews, but I just got one from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that was not very nice. Mm-hmm. And one of the criticisms was that like these New Yorkers, like who cares about these New Yorkers? They're like rich and like snobby. And I was like, oh wow, like I don't see them that way. And I mean, I understand that like the characters certainly have a lot of privilege and are, you know, they have a big house on the Upper West Side, but as my parents do.
Wait, this is really interesting.
But they're not, I don't know, right now in 2014, the Upper West Side and Manhattan is one kind of thing. But when I was a kid in the 80s, it was really different. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, people had money. But the kids who I grew up with on the Upper West Side, their parents weren't hedge fund managers. They were teachers and therapists, and like it wasn't fancy the way it is now. Like now it's like glitzy, and there are like all these chain, you know, luxury brands on every corner. But when I was a kid, it was like women with like sort of frizzy hair, and glasses and clogs. Like it was Bohemia. Mm-hmm. And the Upper East Side was where all the rich people were. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, that's what the Upper West Side is like. Is, even though I know it's not really like that anymore. But yeah, I was surprised to read this woman's comments.
Well, that may also be a kind of retribution for all of the love that they gave you last time. Like just this sort of recalibration.
Yeah, they were like, actually, we take that back. Citizenship revoked.
Well, you had been living in Wisconsin too, you know, so like they probably loved that. And
yeah. Right. Now I'm just another coastie.
This is a pretty good place for us to start. And one of the other things that I'm thinking when we talk about the fact that you have managed to hold on to some core values in terms of personality from your parents, it's a pretty short journey over to the next question, which would be that you have also kind of maintained a very similar professional disposition.
Yeah. So on Facebook today, my uncle, my father's youngest brother, posted a thing saying that he had seen a review of my new book in People magazine and that he was so excited and that people should read it. And one of his friends commented and said, oh, you know, I've always read your brother's books, so I'll read this one. And I commented after that, and I was like, just so you know, my book is really different than my dad's books. I just felt like he maybe needed a warning in case he thought that that's what he was going to get. Because yes, in some ways I have absolutely, not in some ways, in every way I have gone into the family business. I am a writer. That is how I make my money.
And your father is also a writer.
And my father is a writer. My father is a novelist. He's written, I think, 20 books, give or take. And I'm on my third. So yes, family business all the way. But my father's books are dark and scary. So the profession is the same, but the actual books are very, very, very different, which I think is what makes me feel not weird about it. I think if I was going to write scary books, I would have a really big complex. Like, for example, so my dad wrote 2 books with Stephen King, The Talisman and Black House, and Steve King has 3 kids, 2 of whom are writers. Both of his sons are writers. One of them, Owen, his younger son, is about my age, and he's written 2 books, a story collection and a novel, and they're straight up literary fiction, so there's no real conflict there. But Owen's older brother, Joe, is a horror writer too, and he publishes books under a different name, under the name Joe Hill, because obviously he knew that if he started publishing horror novels that people were going to come gunning for him.
Yeah.
And so he sort of got around that by publishing books that were very well received under a different name, and then he sort of came out as Stephen King's son. But luckily, our books are so different that I don't really feel that way, even though there's a lot of like sort of weird stuff that comes up with doing the same thing as your parent. I'm sure you'll agree.
What do you remember seeing when you were growing up, though? Like, what was your vision of your dad and your parents and of writing?
Well, it had a lot to do with jazz, mostly because my bedroom was pretty close to my father's office. And I mean, their house is big, but it didn't matter really where you were. You could hear the music that my dad was playing while he was writing. Loud, loud, loud music. Mostly jazz, sometimes opera, but almost always jazz. And that was good. That was a good sound because that meant that he was in there, he was working, and he was happy. Mm-hmm. I've said this before in lots of interviews and stuff, so I apologize if this is sort of like a canned answer, but really I think that the thing that I'm most grateful to my father for is showing me that writing, while of course it is an art, it is something that comes from deep inside you and like it is meaningful and mysterious and all of that, even though it is that, it is also a job mm-hmm. that you can choose to do and that you can treat like any other job. So you have to do it every day and you have to go to your place and sit down and be really dedicated. I think a lot of my friends from, not just my friends from graduate school, but, you know, friends that I sort of met in that time in my life, that's what other people didn't have. And I sort of assumed that like everyone knew that mm-hmm. like there's no waiting for the muse. Mm-hmm. You can't wait to be inspired to write because that's for amateurs. Like real writers understand that you have to work at it and you have to sit down and do it, even if maybe you don't feel like it, or maybe you don't feel like the lightning bolt has just appeared over your head. You know, I had a lot of friends who were really good writers, but who didn't necessarily take it quite as seriously, or they took it very seriously and in this sort of precious way, but not seriously as in like day in, day out, this is life. And so I feel really grateful that I got to see that like my dad like got up and like put on a suit. I do not get dressed up to write, but you know, he went to work.
Yeah.
Only his work was writing and it was in our house.
Yeah. But it was demystified. I mean, I think that's kind of what I hear is that when you haven't seen it,
yeah,
it's easy to kind of romanticize or have some sort of mystical idea of what it is, and it could take you a long time to realize that it is actually just work in the same.
Yeah.
But you also have to, I mean, I think it might be possible to start with very little natural ability and to hone it and study it and work on it and develop a craft or a technique.
Yeah.
But I think it certainly helps if you have some kind of predisposition.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think anyone who really wanted to be a writer could be a writer. I think that, you know, there are lots of different writers needed in the world. There are lots of different books needed in the world. Am I the same kind of writer as like Jhumpa Lahiri? No, I wish I was, but I'm not, you know, or like Zadie Smith. Like there are a lot of people out there mm-hmm. who are such beautiful writers, and I just know that they are in a different category than I am. And that's fine. And then there are other writers like in the opposite direction from me too. You know, like there's like Nicholas Sparks. Like mm-hmm. Nicholas Sparks is a writer. He sure is. Mm-hmm. He writes lots of books. James Patterson, like mm-hmm. they write lots of books and people buy them and love them. But are they the same kind of writer I am? No, not exactly.
It sounds like early on you recognized that if you're going to be a writer, you have to find your place as a writer.
Yeah.
You know, I think some people maybe just would say like, I just knew I needed to write. And then you kind of over time find your place, which may be part of what happened to you. But what you say is the world needs lots of different kinds of writers, which sort of says to me, you, as you approached learning how to become a writer, also were asking yourself this essential question that maybe not everybody would ask, which is, well, what kind of writer does the world need me to be, or do I need to be for the world?
Well, I don't think you can choose, but I think you do have to figure it out. Like when I was in my early 20s, I was an English major and creative writing major at Oberlin, but I was writing poems that were terrible, and the professors hated me, except for Dan Shawn, who loved me because We would talk about horror movies and like TV shows and smoke cigarettes together. He was
good combo.
He was a good professor. I didn't take any fiction classes at Oberlin because, and this is folly, I thought I was too serious for them. I was like, those people are just playing around. They're not serious about it. They're not actually going to be writers. They're just like, I didn't think that it was something you could do like that. Like I was like, I looked down on the whole endeavor.
Study fiction?
Yeah, right. Because I mean, this shows you what I guess I thought about poetry at the time, which was like my major. But I took it too seriously. I didn't want to be in a class. I was an idiot. Like I wish I could go back and take all the classes that I could have, especially from Dan, who taught fiction there, and he's one of my favorite writers. But at the time, I was a snob. And a very particular kind of snob, which is that I thought that the people in the class were going to be too snobby. I thought like I was like of the people, and like I was like really going to be a writer and like write books that people wanted to read.
But fiction?
Yeah, but I didn't know how. Which is why when I graduated, I was like, I'm going to write a novel in 3 months. And I did. And it was Wuthering Heights, set in my high school, and it was a mess. It was huge. To date, the longest book that I've written. Mm-hmm. And it was a total mess because I didn't know what I was doing at all. And I got an agent, and that it got sent out all over town. I got 100 rejections, maybe even more, which is actually hard if you think about how many publishers there are.
Right. You have to get rejected by everybody.
Every single one, big and small. Like, Random House to like...
Some random house.
Thank you. That was actually the joke that I should have made. That was good, Leo. By the way, I told your joke on the dinner party download.
You did?
I did.
Did it go over well? We don't know.
Yeah, they loved it. So I wrote this big book. It got rejected by everybody. And I was like, okay, maybe I'm not that kind of writer. Let me try to write a mystery novel. So I wrote a mystery that was a disaster. Also, it was there was a lot of sex. There were like dead people. I don't know. It was bad. And that got rejected all over town. I was like, okay, maybe I'm not a mystery writer. Maybe I should write a fantasy novel. Mm-hmm. People love those. Mm-hmm. So I tried that, and that didn't work. And then I was like, okay, this is a disaster. I need help.
Yeah.
I'm not too good to ask for help. Maybe I should go to graduate school and see if I can learn something. So I did, and I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I got to practice, and I got to start small, which had never occurred to me. It's like writing short stories is actually really good practice for writing novels, and that's where I actually started to figure out what kind of writer I was, and it was really fun. Like, I mean, I loved every minute of it. I think everyone who wants to should go to graduate school if you don't have to pay for it. Like, not Columbia where you have to pay $100,000, but...
you mentioned earlier before we started rolling that you've been getting some really nice reviews for the new book. And unlike the kinds of reviews that you saw in the first book, they're focused more on the content of the book and less about your sort of persona.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of your essays that I think were destined initially for like teenage girls, and for me that's not surprising because if you have the heart of a musician, I have the heart of a teenage girl, so I was totally into all of that. But I think that your voice, your essay voice, your personal voice as you, I think it's wonderful that people are focused on the book and not only on you. And I want to at some point talk about your sort of public persona as well. You did teach me how to tweet, although I could still use some pointers from you. But it seems to me that developing that strong personal essay voice might have influenced your fiction writing as well.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I think what people are responding to with the new book, with Vacationers, is the voice. And I'm not surprised because the new book is a lot more like the voice that you're talking about in the essays. Like Laura Lamont is, even though I don't really think of it like it, it's a historical novel. It starts in 1920 and it goes for 50 years. And I had to do research, and like I've never been good at that. And even though the reviews were mostly good for Laura, I knew that it was a stretch for me. Like it wasn't the most natural, obvious book for me to write, which is why I'm really proud of it. And I hope that I do that again and again over the course of my career. But I'm not surprised that people are responding well to the voice in the new book, because it came very naturally to me. Mm-hmm. And not to say that people are obviously like the voice that comes more naturally to me, but I think that there's a certain easiness in the prose that comes off, like that it's not just that it was easy for me to write. I think the rhythm is better because, see, I'm a musician.
See, there it is.
But yeah, I mean, I think that that's true, that because it was sort of easier for me to write, it's easier for people to read.
To read as well.
And also, this new book is funny, and Laura had maybe a couple of like split seconds of humor, but not very much. And humor is a lot of the way I look at the world, and so I think that helps too. People like things that are funny.
People like to laugh.
They like
that sort of thing. What was the voice like in your first novels?
Oh, God, I don't know. Oh, I would be horrified to go back and read them.
Writing those books and being rejected, the way you frame it today is what got you to school. To say, yeah. I need to go to school.
Yeah.
Was there anything else in the process of writing those, or in the whole sort of gestalt of doing the whole thing, that you think was useful to you?
Absolutely. I mean, the rejections were hugely useful, and not just because they made me realize that, like, maybe I wasn't doing things quite right, but more than that, they made me totally cool with getting rejected. Like, you can reject me 1,000 times and I won't care. I have a friend who's an editor at Tin House, which is a wonderful magazine, literary magazine. I got an email from them saying that they're open to submissions for their new issue, and I forwarded that email to another writer friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, I can't send them something. They just rejected something that I wrote." And I said, "Well, of course you can. Of course you can."
They didn't reject everything.
They didn't reject everything. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's something, I don't know if it has something to do with being a woman. Like, I know that there are all these statistics about how men are much more likely to resubmit somewhere after they've been rejected than women are, which is crazy to me. Like, I don't take it personally at all. And that I did at the time. Like, at the beginning, I took it personally. I had lists of everyone's names, and I was, distraught. Have
you come into contact with some of those early rejectors?
Every single one of them. So my editor, so the last couple of weeks, I don't want to get too into this, but like the last couple of weeks have been really crazy for me professionally, because I parted ways with an agent and I signed on with a new agent. And then less than a week after that, my beloved editor at Riverhead took a job as an editorial director at Echo, which is part of HarperCollins. And so I was like, oh God, what? Like, my whole professional life is different now than it was a week ago. So the editor who has bought my books and who I adore and is my friend, she was always my, like, if I had built an altar in my house to like pray to in order to get a book published, her picture would have been at the very top, because she wrote me the best rejection letters for my earliest books. I don't know if she got all 3 of them. She definitely had the first 2. And she wrote me these wonderful rejection letters. And one of them I read, maybe 4 years ago now I read. So this all happened, I guess, in like 2002, 2003, these early novels.
Right, when you were finishing college, when you got out of college.
Yeah, and one of her rejection letters said, it makes me so sad to pass on this, and I am so jealous of the editor who gets to work with Emma. And I was like, oh, it's beautiful, because I wasn't ready. And then when I was ready, she was there, and she was ready, and we both knew it.
But so there was obviously something there. I mean, as much as you say it was a mess and you can't imagine, I mean, there had to have been something in those early books that... Oh,
God. They were full of fire. Or the first one was full of fire.
Yeah.
The first one was like... There was incest. It was filthy and ambitious and ridiculous.
And you were 22 or
and
23.
I was 22, and had no idea what I was doing. I don't think I even like formatted the dialogue correctly. Like it was a mess on many levels.
Right. Well, you hadn't taken any fiction writing classes in college. You didn't.
Yeah, but I had read books.
Right.
But yeah, no, there was something there. There was something there. There was some like raw, I don't know if it was talent or ambition or both, drive. There was something driving that book.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that distinction. Maybe this is going to sound naive considering I've known you for a while, but I never considered that you might be ambitious. I just considered that you wanted to be a writer. And I've been watching you because although what we do is different, I also dealing with the fact that I'm sort of a second generation and have had to confront it in my own way. How do I find my own career?
Yeah.
And just talking to you earlier today, I got the sense that, you know, with success, you have to confront your ambition also. Confronting failure is very difficult. And you have to see who you see yourself in a new way. But confronting success is also difficult.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is that you had some ambition early on.
Oh, yeah.
And now that you have some success, you get to sort of like come into contact with that ambition again and figure out what you want to do.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, I think part of it, you know, you asked me earlier what I sort of took away from, you know, having a parent who's a writer. And part of it was that I saw what it was like, you know, the life of like a working writer, what that was like and all that. But it was also that my dad got to write books, write stories, make things up for a living, and paid for me to go to private school, and paid for my braces, and paid for my horseback riding lessons, and Betsy Johnson dresses, and like all the other ridiculous things that I wanted. And I want to do that too, you know, especially now that I have a kid. Like, I want to give him everything, and I want to be able to afford it. Like, so I'm not, you know, when I talk about ambition, it's both, you know, I want to write good books. Number one, I want to write books that people read, and I want to write books that sell a lot of copies. Like that has always been part of it for me. Like, I don't want to write a book that 3 people think is beautiful and nobody else ever sees. Like, that's not what I want. I have a lot of friends who are, I don't know if they're sort of more pure minded than I am, but the commercial part of it was always a part of the equation for me. And so, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of ambition, and I mean, in that way. And then I also have other worlds that I want to conquer. You know, so my first book was all about the movies. It's because I love the movies. You know, I want to write for the movies. I want my books to be movies. I want all of that. I love to watch television. I mean, honestly, if like House Hunters International wanted me to write for them, I would write for them. I could do that in my sleep. I want to do it all. I want to, you mentioned my essays. I want to have an essay collection. You know, I want to write more stories. I want to write everything.
I think that where one of these little overlapping areas between being a writer and being a musician or being a songwriter is in that question of whether or not you want to be commercial or not. And if you want to be commercial, then you make certain choices to be as good and interesting and creative and innovative if possible in a more commercial way. Yeah. And I have a lot of musician friends who are the same way. That's sort of like, I don't know if I would say, is it an aesthetic? Is it just a question of, like you say, are they more pure? Do they reject being commercial because it's so competitive, or they just don't? It's less sophisticated, or I don't know. But that is a common question, I think, that crosses over. Yeah. But while we are like lingering in this little area of post-college novel rejection, you also really at that time delved into what it means to have a musician's heart when you assisted a musician for a long time. Yes.
That it is the job that I held the longest, was as a personal assistant to Stephen Merritt, who is the songwriter behind the Magnetic Fields and the Sixths and the Gachis and what is it, Future Bible Heroes, and he does lots of things. But yeah, I mean, he was my favorite musician.
Starting when?
In college. I discovered the Magnetic Fields, and I loved them.
What did you love about them?
I loved that they were funny and smart. My husband and I have this argument all the time about music. What's more important, music or lyrics? Because your 3-year-old could write the lyrics to every song ever written, and Mike would be like, "This perfect. It's perfect. It's great. It's profound. I love it." As long as he responded to whatever else it was. Like he pays more attention. He pays more attention to the drummer than a singer all the time. Whereas I'm totally the opposite. I'm like, I don't know. Was there music playing? I don't know. I'm just listening to the words. That's not true always, obviously. Like there are a lot of musicians who I listen to who are, if not more about the music, then at least it's sort of more equal. But yeah, with the magnetic fields, it's really about the words and the melody, and that's what I love the most. And I had miraculously sort of a few friends in common with the band. All of my good things in my life come through my dad. It's because my father is friends with Neil Gaiman, who's another writer, who is friends with the magnetic fields, and this other writer named Kelly Link was friends with them. And so we were sort of orbiting them in this way. And Stephen needed a personal assistant, and I had just graduated from college. I was working at a publishing company, which I hated, and I quit that job, and I started working for Stephen, buying him underwear and dog food and alphabetizing his lyrics and typing things up for him and doing whatever he needed, making him tea in the morning. And it was great. I loved it so much. And then from there, we sort of just gotten more and more involved. I say we because I went on tour with them by myself once, and it was miserable. I cried. I would lock myself in the bathroom and cry. I don't know why I was so unhappy, but I hated it. And then I was like, oh, can my boyfriend come with us? Who had been like basically a roadie for like 100 ska bands in high school. And he loved touring. So I was like, I will be happy if he's there. And it turned out it was great. We were the perfect team because we would design all the merch, all the t-shirts and tote bags and whatever. We would worry about ordering them and making sure they got to the venue and all that. And really, Mike did all of the work. And it was my job to entertain the crowd at the merch booth. It was my job to remember all their fans and to remember people's names and to remember who they were and, who was sort of allowed to go see Steven backstage. And it was my job to sneak backstage and take photos. And I don't know. We divided up the responsibilities really well, and it was great. And we went on tour with them a million times, and we had so much fun. We did the blog, and I still do all their tweeting.
You do?
I do. Do you want me to tweet at you from the mag fields?
Yeah, we'll discuss that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I loved it. Stephen tried to teach me how to play the ukulele. It did not take.
One thing I think is interesting is that you maintained that relationship even as your writing career unfolded. I mean, you still maintain it. You're tweeting for them.
Yeah.
I just think it's such a – like I didn't realize that you had been working at a publishing company. I mean, if you were interested in writing and in sort of furthering your career as a writer, I don't know, the obvious choice would be, well, even though I hate this, I'm going to keep doing this because this is going to get me closer to what I want to do, as opposed to buying dog food for somebody who I respect but isn't really exactly in the field that I want to be in. Maybe not the obvious move.
Yeah, you would think, but it's not. It's actually totally not true.
Right.
That my job in publishing was working as an assistant to an editor and a publicist. I was their shared assistant. And it was a nightmare. And it really had nothing to do with writing. And it wasn't creative. And I wasn't even around the creative people. Mm-hmm. I met my husband in the art department. He was doing creative stuff, but I wasn't. I was like proofreading press releases and making a lot of photocopies and sending books to magazines. I wasn't doing anything interesting. And maybe at another publisher, I don't know. I mean, the publisher that I was working at was sort of art books and cookbooks, like very beautiful objects, but no fiction. Mm-hmm. So maybe if I'd been working at a different kind of publisher, it would have felt more connected to writing, but it really didn't. And so it was very easy for me to say, like, that is not for me.
Yeah.
I am getting out of here. In fact, I think it would have been harder if I'd had a job at, Knopf or at Penguin, or I don't know, if at any of the publishers that I really fantasized about being published by. I think it would have been harder to ultimately make that shift, because I would have been surrounded by the sort of business side of it, and I think it would have been harder.
I think it's a huge question that we all confront when deciding whether or not it makes more sense to work as close as possible to what your dream is, or if it's better to sort of like do something that, I mean, there's a couple of options. One is to just make some money in something totally non-creative, and so that you're not wasting your creative energy, so that by the time you sit down to do your own writing or your own work, you're sort of wasted.
Yeah.
And like our mutual friend Tommy, who's a writer, I've sort of discussed with him, like, well, why don't you work as a writer instead of in a restaurant?
Yeah.
And, I think his argument has been, my relationship with writing is what it is, and I don't want to change that or contaminate it in any way.
Yeah.
What I think you did, though, that I think is kind of cool, is that you did something that you liked, even though it wasn't. And Stephen is a writer. I mean,
yes. And I mean, Stephen, I don't know how I would describe my relationship with him, but I mean, in many ways, I think of him as a family member at this point, because I don't know, he and I play like Scrabble on our phones all day long, and I know, he has Thanksgiving with my parents. Like he is part of my family. Yeah. He is part of my family, but in some ways, he was also a mentor type figure. Because even though I am not a songwriter, nor do I aspire to be one, he is just a genius, and a genius with words. And he will correct my grammar and tell me when I'm using a word incorrectly. Spending time with him is always edifying. And it's also just nice to be around someone who cares that much about words. And he has so many rhyming dictionaries, and he reads so much and so widely, and so I could talk to him about Henry James. I could talk to him about the Golden Bowl if that's what I've just read and I see that on his shelf or whatever. It's not that I could only talk to him about music.
If watching your dad approach writing as a proper job gave you one window into what the writing process could be, what window did Stephen give you into the creative process?
I guess writing could also be sort of, more, I don't want to say more all-consuming, because it certainly consumes my father. But just that Stephen, it's his job, but it's also really 24 hours a day for Stephen. He's changed a little bit from how he was when I was working for him. So I started working for him in 2002 or 2003. This is 10 years ago. But I would show up at noon and wake him up. And when I would leave at 6 or 7, he would go out, and he would really be out then until 3 or 4 in the morning, sitting in bars, drinking, smoking, and writing. And he doesn't do 2 of those things anymore, but he's still writing, obviously, but he doesn't drink or smoke anymore. And that's a big difference. But he was just always working, always, all the time. Always writing, which was, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, weird. So my TV got hit by lightning 2 days ago, and our cable box got fried, but our DVD player for some reason still works. And so to test it out, we put in the closest DVD, which was Strange Powers, which was this documentary about the magnetic fields, which Mike did the cover for and whatever. And so I happened to have watched this recently, but there was something about how Stephen is always writing in his notebook that reminded me of how I was as a teenager, how I was obsessed with writing things down all the time and taking notes all the time. And I don't do that anymore. I don't know if it's because I could blame it on the baby, certainly, but it's been longer than that. I'm not as obsessive as I was. Stephen really is obsessive about working and about writing things down. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I was more like that.
You tweet for the Magnetic Fields. Up until recently, you worked in a bookstore.
Yeah.
You wrote all your failed novels while being his assistant.
Yeah.
You have a very active social media schedule. At least it seems that way to me.
Boy.
You do a lot. You watch a lot of movies and TV, or at least it seems like you do. But I think the reason it does is because everything in your life is available to every other part of your life. Like, it's not something you don't compartmentalize and say, well, now I'm not being Emma.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people professionally kind of put it away.
Yeah.
And it all kind
I
of...
should probably put it away more, but I don't.
Well, but what would you put away? For example, you wrote a personal essay last year that was very much a kind of a reveal of some of the physical stuff that you had been dealing with.
Yeah.
You took something that other people might have said, you know what, this is my private life, and I'm not going to mix that with my writing career, for example. And instead you said, this is what I went through trying to get pregnant. This is all the physical stuff I've been dealing with. And you wrote about it.
Right. But I didn't write about it like as it was happening. I wrote about having a miscarriage, but I wrote about it when I was about to have a baby. I don't know who you're paying attention to on the internet, but there are a lot of people I know, most of whom are writers, who like really give you the blow by blow as it's happening. And that is just, it's too much for me. I love to share things with the world, whether it's a really cute picture of my baby or whether it's what I had for lunch, all that boring stuff that people complain about. I love to do all that stuff. But if there's something like an actual problem, there is no way I'm going to talk about it on the internet. For a few reasons, because it's something that I'm still sorting through, and I am a writer and I like to know how things end, you know what I mean, before I process them. And also because it's, you know, I mean, I do think that there are things that are just private. Like if I have an argument with my husband, I'm not going to put that on Twitter because that's not fair to him. And who does that? That's weird. But also I don't know. I think that I see social media and all of that stuff as a place to be positive. Like, I don't want to complain. I don't want to talk shit about other people. I see it as an office party, like an office Christmas party. And sure, do you maybe like pull your like office wife or husband aside and like say horrible things about what your boss is wearing? Sure, you can do that privately. But in terms of like what you say when you know that everyone else is listening to you, you should only be saying nice things. Like, you should not be complaining about your life. You shouldn't be criticizing someone else's.
The reason I sort of brought it up in that way was because you were talking about watching Stephen, the documentary about the magnetic fields, and how when you watched him writing everything down and you thought, well, I'm not like that anymore. I don't have that obsessive passion about writing everything down. And maybe social media is that.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think so, because I mean, I don't know if you ever kept a diary or whatever. Yeah, what I'm talking about is not like the art making stuff
or the business,
and it's not the business stuff, and it's like the just personal cataloging of your like private thoughts, like not the stuff you'd put on Twitter, but like the stuff that you would really write in your diary.
I never did that. I always, probably because of what I was modeling, thought that you're supposed to turn everything into product. Yeah. You know, as a matter of fact, I remember I had early, friends in high school and college that would journal, and I would say, but you're not doing anything because doesn't have a purpose. You have to have a purpose for it. Yeah. You journal. You're talking about a time when you were obsessively journaling, and that sounds like
it was because I was unhappy.
Was this in high school?
Yeah, it was like high school and college.
I want to talk about high school.
I was just unhappy.
What do you mean?
Well, I was a teenager. Were you happy when you were a teenager? I mean, I was happy in some ways. I loved my friends. I loved smoking menthols. Yeah. There were a lot of things that
you went to a pretty cool high school.
I went to St. Anne's here in Brooklyn, which is a very, very cool high school. There are no grades. You call all your teachers by their first names. I took poetry. I took an opera appreciation class several years running.
What were you into in high school?
I was into cigarettes. I was into malt liquor. I was into poetry. I was into boys. That's it, really. I was into vintage clothing, poetry, boys, cigarettes, vintage clothing.
There's a part of your identity, I feel like, that has been sometimes still working out the kind of nerdy girl obsessed with the cool guy.
Oh, yeah. There's this character, Sylvia, in my new book, who, I mean, so the book, The Vacationers, is about this family, mother, father, daughter, son, and...
So far fits your essential profile.
Yeah, and in many ways, I keep expecting people to sort of ask me how close it is to my life, and they're not asking me that for some reason. But they're not. I mean, the parents are nothing like my parents.
They live on the Upper West Side.
They live on the Upper West Side. Yes. Their location is similar. But really, like Sylvia, the girl who in the novel is 18 and has just graduated from high school, heading off to college, is very much the way I was as a teenager. And it was really fun to sort of go back to that and be like, she likes boys, but she's not really sure how to like do that. And she loves her family, but she also wants some distance from them. And yeah. And I write for, as you mentioned, I write for teenage girls a lot for Rookie. So that stuff feels very present to me. I think about myself as a teenage girl a lot just because I'm often writing for a teenage audience. And yeah, God, it is hard to be a teenage girl.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it's really hard to be a teenage boy too.
I don't think it's the same.
It's not the same, but I'm sure it's hard because, I don't know, your body's changing. Oh, God. And you just have to figure so many things out in such a short span of time.
Do you have any technique, or like when you sit down to change your tone for a teenage audience and a young adult audience, or the sort of like perfect, ideal, sophisticated adult reader?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you make that shift?
I don't know if I do. I mean, there are definitely some pieces that I know are good for Rookie or not good for Rookie, but mostly it has to do with subject matter where, I can't write about marriage and pregnancy and having a child for Rookie because that's not where that reader is. Mm-hmm. And that reader would be like, boring, skip, pass. But in terms of tone, I think my tone is pretty consistent in terms of my nonfiction. But yeah, I don't know. In terms of fiction, it's hard. It's hard to say. I don't know. I haven't figured that out. I would like to write YA fiction someday. My dad and I actually wrote a story together for this anthology called Exo Orpheus that's about sort of updating myths. And my dad and I wrote a story based on the myth of Persephone, and it's about like a 13-year-old girl, and it felt very YA. I don't know if he really thought it was YA, but I really saw it as YA. That was really fun, and it didn't feel different. Like it didn't feel tonally different.
It sounds like if you let the subject lead it, that most of the work is done.
Yeah, yeah.
And I alluded also to the fact that you have an ongoing relationship with a particular bookstore and as a bookseller.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier before we started talking also about how your understanding of the business of book selling and promoting books and publishing books is maybe as informed by your experience working as a bookseller as it is growing up the child of a writer.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, especially when I was a child in the 80s when my dad had lots of huge bestsellers. And so my understanding of publishing was very skewed. And I understood that editors were very nice people who sometimes came over to your house for dinner parties. And that's sort of what I understood. That was kind of it. But working at a bookstore, you see you see everything. With my dad, I understood that he worked really hard by himself for a long time. And then, boop, he sent off a book, and then he worked on it with the editor. And then, boop, then it went off into the world, and that was it. Mm-hmm. Like his job ended like publication day. Whether sure maybe he went on a book tour, but that wasn't really that important or exciting or whatever. Like that wasn't really work. But then when I started working at the bookstore, I started working there in I guess 2009, right when I moved back from Madison. I suddenly had a much deeper understanding of the whole ecosystem, because at a bookstore, of course, the job starts when the book emerges into the universe and is on the shelf. Or actually, that's not even true. So the galleys arrive, right? The advanced copies arrive, and the booksellers maybe read them, maybe they don't read them, maybe they get excited about them and talk about them on Twitter. Maybe you take a picture of it and put it on Instagram. All that stuff suddenly matters.
But that's for contemporary.
Right.
I mean, that wasn't necessarily the reality when your dad was having bestsellers.
Yeah, no, obviously not. And there were many, many, many more bookstores then than there are now. But now I think because it's a smaller field, you've got Amazon on the one hand, and you've got Barnes & Noble, and then you've got all these indies. It's really important for the writer to stay involved after the book comes out now.
And this is something you saw as a bookseller.
Yeah. So the bookstore that I worked at is called Book Court. It's here in Brooklyn in Cobble Hill. And there are some writers who live in the neighborhood or in Brooklyn who would pop in regularly. And I'm sure they weren't there to do this. I'm sure they were just there because they're writers and they read books and they like bookstores, obviously. But for me as a bookseller, if someone wanders in every now and again, I'm also reminded of them. And then when someone comes in and says, if Courtney Sullivan comes in with her dog and we're talking to her and we're petting her dog and it's so great and she's so nice, God, what a lovely woman. And then she leaves and then a customer comes in and says, I'm looking for a present for my daughter who's graduating from college. I say, you know what? I have just the book for you, Commencement by Courtney Sullivan. And I pull it off the shelf. I mean, that's very direct, and it doesn't happen like that, obviously, but it does. I don't know. It helps if writers are physically there. And then obviously not every writer lives around the corner from every bookstore, and social media becomes that way that you can connect. So I have bookseller friends who have bookstores in Maine and New Hampshire or in California and in Minneapolis. I have friends who work at all these different bookstores. It's really, it's beneficial to me as a reader because I have lots of people to talk about books with and we all get very excited about the same sorts of things. And so that's satisfying to me. And it's also satisfying to me as a writer because I know that they are more likely to hand sell my book because they like me and because they want to help sort of support the home team.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, writers never had to work this hard, and
you obviously know a lot of writers of your parents' generation also, and I suspect that many of them are struggling with this in the same way that I think a lot of musicians and musical artists of my parents' generation, my father's generation, are sort of struggling with the idea that they're somehow now responsible. And these are people who have been managed in every facet of their lives and their careers, people that never had to personally go out and really represent themselves and their work. There was somebody else who did that. Yeah. Actually, hearing you talk about it, it raises a question also for me about how you confront being a writer in the midst of all of that. You're obviously a good bookseller. You're passionate about books. Over the years, musicians also have worked in record stores, and that's given them both an understanding of what's out there and who's doing it and also of the business. But I think it would be very fatiguing then also to have to go and actually write after all of that.
I mean, working in the bookstore never felt sort of tiring for me in that way because it wasn't a full-time job. Yeah. And also it was in some ways really invigorating to be in the bookstore because it meant that I was reading more and I could just pull something off the shelf and just read a little bit of it and say, oh, that's what.
Did it affect your writing?
I think it probably made me a better writer. It didn't affect me in any sort of particular direct way, except that I was reading more, which made me a better writer, I'm sure. And I miss being in the bookstore because, at home, I'm surrounded by books, but they're all books that I've chosen. And bought and brought home. Whereas in the bookstore, they're like, I haven't read that person. What is that person
A more
like?
Promiscuous reader.
Yeah.
And what about the older generation of writers, or even the younger generation of writer who just isn't suited to that?
I have one friend of mine in particular who I won't name is a really, really, really good writer and hates all of that social media stuff so much, and he just won't do it. And on the one hand, I think good for him because you can't force it, and if you find it soul destroying, then don't do it. And I totally respect his decision. But I do think that it maybe costs him something. And I think he's probably aware of it. And I think that a young writer who makes that decision is aware that they're losing something. Older writers, I don't know if they're aware of that loss. My dad loves to tweet and go on Facebook and all of that stuff. But he sees it just as something fun. Like he wouldn't go on Twitter to like tell everyone that he was having a reading or something. I'm like, Dad, no, that's what it's for. Like, if you put on Twitter, those people will come because they love you. He doesn't see it that way. He would rather just tweet about The Bachelor or whatever, which is fine. I mean, it's to each his own, But I see all of that stuff as very much a part of my job.
Tweet his own.
Tweet his own. Oh, Leo.
No. You see that? Well, I
see it as part of my job.
You see it as part of your job. But this is the mystery, and this is why I say that you taught me how to tweet, because I think we tweeted a photo at some wedding that you showed me how to tweet a photo, which I think is like one of the 4 photos I've ever tweeted. But it's because I'm also not a writer like you, and so I haven't been thinking about what is my tone, my personal tone. I mean, I think we all are, whether or not we know it, kind of writers who find our tone on Facebook and on Twitter.
Yeah.
I understand the idea of sharing parts of my personal life, and I understand the idea of tweeting when a new episode of the podcast comes out or I have a gig or something.
Yeah.
What is this kind of gray area for me is, well, how far do I take it in this direction? How far do I take it in that direction? And when am I sharing too much personally? And when am I doing it too much? And
when am I sharing too much professionally, too?
Yes,
that's a real problem.
That's a big one.
That is a big no-no.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
But I think the more you share personally or in a non-promotional way, the more you can kind of justify sharing more professionally.
Yeah.
Because then you're just
a motor mouth.
Yeah.
Which I am. I mean, and like I think I do a lot of both. But when my first novel came out, I was on it and I tweeted the shit out of it, like just crazy. Every time I got any review, I would put it out into the world. And I'm not doing it this time. I'm not doing it because I don't have the time that I used to have, and because I realize now how annoying that is. I have a lot of friends who are publishing their first books, and sometimes people just get so excited. And I don't want to sort of pick on people because I understand, like I did it too. And I think everyone gets one book where you absolutely lose your mind because you are so grateful and so excited that you cannot help yourself. But now I can help it. And I don't want to annoy people, and I don't want to just be like a loudspeaker, just like talking about myself all the time. Like it seems repugnant. So, I mean, at this point, I would rather share too much of my personal life and too many pictures of my baby.
Which, by the way, as you become more of a well-known person, I'm curious if you would reconsider that.
I don't know.
I have friends in South America, obviously they're in South America, so it's a different thing, who blur out a picture of their kids.
Yeah.
And, and I'm like, well, it's way too late for me, and that ship has sailed in my life and in yours as well. But you have ambitions beyond writing as well. So at some point,
I mean, I can't imagine that I will ever be so famous that it would complicate my child's life. I cannot. I mean, that would be crazy.
I don't know. But I don't know. I mean, there's people way less famous than you, and certainly less famous than me, who are nervous about that
right.
stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not nervous about it. What do people? Is it like kidnapping?
Kidnapping, I guess, is one thing.
Is that a thing? Why does my mind go right to kidnapping?
No, it is. I think that's like the South American thing. It's like kidnapping, but
child abusers. What are we afraid of?
We're afraid of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, also then there's this question about who owns a photo and whether or not Facebook can exploit the photo. Yeah. There's that.
So we're afraid of kidnapping, child abusers, and Facebook.
And Facebook.
Yeah.
Okay. Make list. You see from your friends who have their books and they're excited and then they're maybe oversharing. Was there any... I mean, let's face it. You were rejected with 3 novels.
In fact, more than that, but yeah.
You were rejected so many times. Yeah. Your skin thickened.
Thick.
And then you went to graduate school and you emerged with a short story collection followed by a novel. Mm-hmm. And that novel was very well received for a first novel.
Yeah, people were nice.
A lot of people who put out their first novel didn't find the same kind of success that you found.
Yeah.
Did it affect your relationship with other writers? Did you find any kind of like...
I don't think so. Writers, of course, are very sensitive. And so while I'm sure that I have some friends who are writers who hadn't sold their first books yet, I'm sure that people were jealous when I sold it. But, not in any real way.
Yeah.
And then they sell their books and then they don't care anymore. So, I mean, it's...
You didn't have to get all new friends.
No, that would have been exhausting.
That's hard work.
Yeah.
That is hard work.
No, I didn't have to get new friends. I'm trying to... No, it didn't cause me any problems like that. I don't think. I don't know. I guess maybe people who I'm not friends with anymore, maybe that's why. You think that's why? No.
I don't know. I'd have to hear an example. I'm thinking about when everybody's kind of all in the stew together, and then one person kind of like emerges as the sort of flavor. Let's just follow the flavor of the moment, or a new notable flavor.
Yeah.
Everybody else is sort of like, well, we've been here too. What is that? But I think that may just be sort of a short-lived and pretty predictable reaction. Within the.
I think so. And what helped me in that way too was that my first book, my short story collection, was originally published by a small press that only printed 2,000 copies of it, and I was working at the bookstore and sold most of those myself. And I was embraced by the sort of small press community, I think, and I was embraced by booksellers. And so when I finally sold my first novel, people were actually really wonderful to me about it because they saw that I'd worked for it, and whether or not those people knew about all my old books that had gotten rejected or not, they saw it as, I think, someone who had put in some time and done a lot of work selling their book, rather than, I wasn't like a 22-year-old who sold my first novel for $500,000 or something like that. Like that, like we can all hate that person,
right?
But
fuck that person,
fuck that guy. But that wasn't my situation, and so even if some people were maybe envious temporarily, I think that everything was okay, and people were very nicely supportive of me from the beginning.
I'm happy to hear that. I think that's that's a happy story. I know you just spent a little bit of time in Nashville.
Yeah.
And
Yeehaw.
I think you kind of sounded like you kind of dug it on it a little bit there.
It's so nice there. Being in Nashville, actually, I said that I was not a songwriter earlier, but being in Nashville made me like want to be a songwriter.
Why?
Because that's what's there. It's just like, it was really nice to be in Nashville because it's not just a small city that's nice and has good food and nice weather and is pretty and whatever, like a lot of other places. It also is the center of something. It's the center of a creative industry that isn't my creative industry, but it is there, right? And so you've got country music, which is rich and varied and full of writers. There's a street called Music Row in Nashville that has all these sort of little bungalow houses and some larger buildings that house all the songwriting offices and all the publishing companies and all that. And they hang these huge banners up for their writers when their writers have a hit song. Yeah. And it's like, Leo Sidran, writer of blank, and it doesn't say sung by Carrie Underwood or whatever. It just says the writer's name. It's like, God, like this is a town that celebrates its writers. It's amazing. Even if it's not the same kind of writer I am. I loved that. And there are all of these like places where you can go to hear songwriters talking about their craft, and it was cool.
So aside from, dealing with the fact that you are not there right now and you're about to promote this new book, are you already thinking about the next project? What is your relationship with writing like at this very moment?
My baby is 9 months old, and I finished this book while I was pregnant, before he was born. But then, you have to sort of do the edits and little things. So I was working on the book still when he was very, very new. And other than that, I have only written, I would say, 1,000-word-ish essays and stories and things like that will be used for promotional stuff around the book. Like, I wrote something for a traveling magazine about how I like cold beaches. I wrote something for Lucky magazine about liking to wear glittery things in my hair.
Which you are doing right now.
Which I am doing right now.
Has that always been part of the process of promoting a book? Like, I know you did that last time too.
I don't know.
But that's kind of par for the course right now?
Yeah. No, now that is just what you do. Like, Oprah Magazine wants you to write this, and Lucky wants you to write this. And I mean, you have to come up with pitches, and it's exhausting, actually. I mean,
you have to come up with the book, write the book, deliver the book, and then think of a half a dozen things that you also want to say.
Yeah. I think at some point, people start to not do that anymore. But in this zone that I'm in, you have to do it all the time. You have to do it like crazy. So that's all I've done. I look forward to the book coming out and coming back from the tour and having some childcare and then being actually able to write. That's my goal, is to start writing something new in July, or start thinking about it at least.
Yeah. And what is the process of thinking about it?
Well, I guess I do have a notebook. It's making little notes. I have some notes already.
You have some ideas.
I have some ideas.
And what about teaching?
Teaching is great. I love teaching. I taught, the reason that we were in Nashville, because I was teaching at Vanderbilt, and those students were so cute and so smart and so good, and I loved them.
Do you see yourself in those students at all?
A little bit, and some of them. They're a little conservative in Vanderbilt. And before that, I mean, since graduate school, I've been teaching in and around the city, but teaching adults. And it was nice to teach students again, college students. Yeah, I love it. It takes up a lot of time, though, because you have to read their work and come up with what you're going to say to them about it, and plan, read whatever stories that you're asking them to read. And so for now, at least, I'm going to take a little break from teaching and just be totally selfish with my childcare hours.
Is there anything that you could say in general that when people are young and tell you they think they might want to be writers, I mean, is there a generalization that you would deliver to them?
Speaking of, tone and such, I just wrote something for Rookie that was how to write a novel, which will go up in June. I mean, the most important thing is just to read as much as possible. That's the most important thing. And then the second thing would be that you have to actually do it. That you can't just, like, right now, I'm a really bad screenplay writer because I talk about writing screenplays and wanting to write screenplays, and I have ideas for writing screenplays, but I've never actually done it. So I need to take my own advice and just do it. But yeah, I mean, I would say, read a lot. That's the most important thing. And then practice, and to not be precious about it, to send things out into the world and see what happens, and to not care if you get rejected. That's important. Yeah.
And what about finding your voice? How does one go about finding their voice?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, by writing a lot. I think, you have to sort of, it's like when you use like a pen for the first time, like it, like it doesn't quite come out right. You have to like get it going. You have to practice, and you have to see what feels good and what is satisfying to you and what people respond to. Like I said this before, I don't think you can really choose what it is, because it's the sound of what comes out of you, like I think when I was younger, I tried to control it too much, and that messed things up for me, and when I stopped worrying about that so much, I realized like, oh, like this actually sort of sounds more like me.
Yeah.
Like Lori Moore, for example, who is one of my favorite writers and someone we both know. When you read a Lori Moore story, you can hear her. You can hear her voice,
yes.
Her actual voice.
Yes.
And I think that's how it should be. You don't want to be surprised by, the things should match up. They should match up. The things that you care about will be in your fiction, and the things that you worry about will be in your fiction, and the things that obsess you and drive you will all be there. It's not, you're not putting on like a hazmat suit and like going into some totally foreign territory. Like,
no, but it's a kind of a funny contradiction between ceasing striving in the sense of like, you have to confront who you are and what you are. And on the other hand, really working at it, so it's that sort of like effortlessness, but then also enormous work.
Yeah.
And that's
basically
life.
That's life of an artist, right? I mean, you want it you know, when you record something, you don't want it to sound like you're busting your ass, but you have to bust your ass to get it to sound that way.
You know, you want,
and that's certainly how I feel about writing, that like, you know, it might not come out right the first time, but like if I work on it and revise it and like really play with it and think about it, then it should sound totally perfect. And like you haven't spent hours working on it. You know, that's the goal.
Well, it seems to me that you are reaching your goals, Emma Straub. Thank you so much for being my first official non-musician victim.
Thank you. You should have my dad on next.
I will have him on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Emma.
Bye.
Emma and Mike and Emma, married on a warm September day. Hey, hey. Emma and Mike and Emma, I hope that I always remember them that way. Mike and Emma, married on a warm September day.